Hello class, this is your Introduction to the Seed Plants focusing on Gymnosperms lecture. Let's get started. Our outline for Gymnosperms is as follows. First we'll do a brief introduction to what classifies the Gymnosperms, and then we'll learn some specific phyla, including the Coniferophyta, which includes the conifers such as pines, and other phyla, including ginkgos, cycads, and the so-called cnidophytes. So when we look at the word gymnosperm, the root word gymno means naked, and sperm refers to seed. And so these are plants that produce seeds, but the seeds are not enclosed in a structure. We're going to see that seed enclosed in a structure in the angiosperms, which is the flowering plants. The gymnosperms have fossil seeds that date back to 360 million years ago, so they're quite ancient and have been around for a long time. The gymnosperm seeds are formed exposed on the surface of a modified leaf that's called the sporophyll, and the sporophylls are spirally arranged to make the strobolus. And in this case, for the gymnosperms, the strobolus almost always looks like a cone. The female gametophyte is contained inside of an ovule, so this is a further containment where now in the previous more primitive plants the female gametophyte was not protected, but now it's protected and retained inside of the ovule. But of course the ovule just is going to be sitting out on the cone scale naked after it gets fertilized. And most of the gymnosperms lack motile sperm, so that means no water is required. Even if the sperm does have a flagellum, it's not about water, it still is about a pollination mechanism to get that sperm to that egg. On the screen here, we can see an artist's rendition of some of the earliest seed fossils. They were found in West Virginia here in the United States, and they were called, quote, seed ferns, unquote, because they produced ovules along the branches with no protection. And then here we can see a characteristic strobolus on a pine tree, and this happens to be the male cones. So there's four major lineages of the gymnosperms on our planet today, and that includes the conifers, ginkgo, the cycads, and the cnidophytes. Now, if we're talking about molecular systematics, the gymnosperms form what we call a paraphyletic group, which means they share a common ancestor with another monophyletic group, and that monophyletic group is the angiosperms. So the gymnosperms plus the angiosperms are usually referred to as the spermatophytes, which is the seed-producing plants. Here we can see some of the evolutionary relationships of the gymnosperms and all the different evolutionary phyla. You can see that there are many groups of gymnosperms that are now extinct. They lived hundreds of millions of years ago, and we know them from the fossil record, but we no longer see them today. Remember, there's only 4 lineages left on our planet today. And then we can see the angiosperms evolved later, according to the fossil record, by a couple 100 million years. So what are the general characteristics of a gymnosperm? Well, most of them have woody sporophytes. These are sporophyte-dominant organisms. The gametophyte is very small, found inside the cone. There are no vessel elements for most of these gymnosperms. We're going to see there is one group that did evolve vessels. Remember, vessels are found in angiosperms, but gymnosperms just have tracheids in their xylem. The gymnosperms have male and female cones that are produced, and some of these species are monoecious and others are dioecious. And the definitions are as follows. If it's monoecious, the root word mono means one. That means we have one plant, one individual plant that has male cones and female cones in different places on one single plant. On the other hand, dioecious, the root word dio means two. That means we have one single plant that only has male cones and another single individual plant that only has female cones. Now, in either case, the female cones are going to produce the female gametophyte, and that is contained inside of the ovule, which forms the seeds. The gametophyte in the gymnosperms is reduced to even fewer cells than the ferns. First phylum is Coniferophyta. This is the conifers. And there are several hundred species in many families. All produce woody stems. They are all trees or shrubs. These are some of the most charismatic and well-known groups of the gymnosperms. It includes things like pines and redwood trees, which we find right here in coastal California. Some of the oldest fossils of the conifers date back about 290 million years ago. They always produce male and female cones, and they always have needle-shaped leaves that are either going to be long needles or they're going to be scale-like in some cases. So they'll look like little overlapping, very, very short needles on top of each other in the form of scales. The phylum Coniferophyta has leaves with thick cuticles and sunken stomata. So these are adaptations for surviving drought. The conifers are mostly monoecious, but a few are dioecious. All the ones that we study in this course are monoecious. And they're mostly evergreens, so most of the conifers retain their leaves for many growing seasons. But there are examples of some, for example, the dawn redwood from China is deciduous, where it drops its leaves every fall or winter. The conifers are very important economically for timber, paper, and other wood products. They dominate the forests of northern temperate climates, and the conifers include some of the largest and oldest plants on our planet. Check out the Hyperion tree, which is Sequoia sempervirens, the iconic coast redwood of coastal California. It's one of the tallest trees in the world at 379.3 feet tall. And to give you some perspective on how tall that is, it's much taller than either the Statue of Liberty in New York City or Big Ben in the United Kingdom. Next up is one of the world's oldest trees, which is Pinus longiva, the ancient bristlecone pines of the White Mountains in California. The oldest tree was long thought to be the Methuselah tree at about 4,800 years old, but that was superseded by the discovery in 2013 of another ancient bristlecone with an age of over 5,000 years old. So that means that this seed germinated 3,000 years BC. Pretty incredible. Now, dendrochronologists can age trees without cutting them down, luckily. By taking core samples with a long drill, we can estimate the age. And the world's largest tree by biomass is the General Sherman, which is in the Sequoia National Park. The giant sequoias are called Sequoiadendron giganteum, and they are huge. I highly recommend visiting this tree in the summer sometime if you have a chance. Now, to give you some perspective on just how big this tree is, of course, pictures don't do it justice. A branch fell off of this tree from the upper canopy in 1978, and just that little branch that fell off, well, it wasn't so little. It had a diameter greater than 6 feet and was at least 140 feet long. So just this one branch was larger than any tree that grows on the east coast of the United States. Pretty phenomenal. All right, so what are the conifer characteristics of the leaves? We're going to use pines as a case study. So we're going to really learn the details of the pines in the conifer group. Pine leaves have a thick cuticle with sunken stomata, an endodermis around the vascular tissue, and resin canals that develop in the mesophyll. And these resin canals and this resin is thought to be an antiseptic or an antifreeze or an insect deterrent to help keep these plants safe. The pines have considerable secondary growth. Now remember, most gymnosperm wood is just tracheids that makes up most of that woody tissue. There's no vessel members or fibers, and thus the pine wood is referred to as softwood. Pines and other conifers almost always develop a mycorrhizal fungus relationship with their roots in the forests that they grow. In review, when we look at the pine stem cross-section, we looked at this back when we did our stems lecture many weeks ago. We can see that what makes up the growth ring is the tracheids, and then we can see resin canals embedded in those growth rings. And when we look outside of this vascular cambium, we find the phloem, and then we get into the outer bark region. Now, when pines reproduce, they have both male cones and female cones. And the male cones are called the pollen cones, and they produce the pollen grains. These male cones are papery and ephemeral, which means that they fall apart after just a couple weeks, and they're almost always produced in the spring months. Now, when we look in a pollen cone, we can look at the cross-section, and we can look at the microsporaphyll, which is the cone scale, and then sitting on the cone scale is a microsporangium, which is the region where the spores are produced. And so the microsporangium produces a microspore, and the microspore develops into the microgametophyte. The microgametophyte is the pollen grain. Notice in the pines there's no antheridium present. All of this happens inside of the microsporangium. Here's another view where we're looking at the microsporophylls. And when we look at the little dots inside of the microsporangium, it's very difficult to tell if it's a microspore or a microgametophyte. We would only know if we zoomed in at high magnification, because we'll see that the microgametophyte has a very unique appearance. And here it is. It looks like a little ball with two wings on it. And those wings allow it to blow through the wind, because most pines are wind pollinated. Now, on the other hand, the female cones are the ovulate cones, and they are almost always much larger than the pollen cones. The ovulate cones also tend to have a woody appearance, and that's because the megasporophylls do develop woody tissue. Now, on these female cones, the ovules are produced in pairs found at the base of the cone scale. And each ovule contains a megasporangium with a nucellus. And this nucellus is the portion of the ovule where the embryo develops. In this case, we want to think of the ovule as the megasporangium. The megasporangium is going to keep dividing and forming these different parts, including spores and gametophytes, and it's all retained inside this one structure that is the ovule. And the nucellus is simply that central portion of our ovule where the embryo develops. Now we're going to get to know this evolutionary trend towards an enclosed embryo. So meiosis takes place inside the megasporangium. However, of the spores produced, only one megaspore survives and develops into the female gametophyte, which we call the megagametophyte. And this megagametophyte is contained inside of the megasporangium. So this is an evolutionary advantage where we're containing our reproductive parts inside layer upon layer of tissue so that it's protected, which is so important. Finally, an integument layer develops to form the seed coat around the ovule after fertilization. So on this slide, we can see a longitudinal section through our pine ovule, and we can see all of the different layers of tissue, including the integument, the nucellus, the female gametophyte, and the archegonium that contains the egg. Now, how does the pollen grain get to the egg? Well, the microgametophyte with those little ears blows through the wind and enters through an opening called the micropyle. This pollen grain carries the sperm to the megagametophyte. This is usually done by wind, but in some cases it's done by pollinators, such as different types of insects as well. And when we look at this longitudinal section and all these layers of tissue inside of our ovule, it really does a nice job of showing us this trend towards enclosure of the embryo. Here we can see our male cone and our female cone, and then we zoom in into the different layers and look at the different types of cells, including the pollen grains and the eggs that are produced. We need to memorize the life cycle of pine, so make certain that you understand how the cones form and all of the cells that are produced. Here's one cycle from an internet source, and here's another diagram from the optional textbook for this course. You want to understand this, but you won't be able to draw it, or you won't have to draw it for our exam. Next up, we have the genus Taxus and the genus Podocarpus. These are what includes the U's. These are unique because the strobilus isn't woody, but rather it's fleshy. It almost looks like a fruit, right? But this isn't a fruit, it's a strobilus. This is a cone. A single ovule is surrounded by a fleshy aril, and this aril is a highly modified megasporophyll. Now for the U's, these plant parts are usually very toxic except for the cone. But these alkaloids found in their leaves can be used as different types of medicine, including a potent anti-cancer medication called Taxol. And when we see this bright red aril, who do you think is going to be drawn to that to eat it and disperse it? If you guessed birds, you are correct. Two other examples of conifers, the juniper and cypress, these don't have needle-like leaves that are long, but rather little short leaves that overlap that look like scales. We have the genus Juniperus, which has small, fleshy strobili, and we have Cupressus macrocarpa. This is the Monterey cypress, and it's planted widely all over California, but it's only native to a very narrow range of coast near the city of Monterey. And some of the trees there are over 2,000 years old. Now, as mentioned earlier, seed plants lack motile sperm, which is an adaptation to a xerophytic or dry environment. Instead, pollen, which is the male gametophyte, carries the male nucleus to the female reproductive structure. But wait! In some of the primitive gymnosperms, flagellated sperm cells still exist. But instead of swimming freely in the environment, as we see in the non-seed plants, including the ferns and even more primitive plants like the bryophytes, they swim down a pollen tube to meet the egg. So we still need a pollination mechanism to get that sperm cell to where the egg is found. Examples of plants with flagellated sperm include ginkgo and cycad. So our next phylum is the Ginkgophyta, and there's only one species on our planet today, which is Ginkgo biloba. It's a living fossil because it's been relatively unchanged in the fossil record for over 150 million years. In fact, it was thought to be extinct to science until it was rediscovered in a Chinese monastery in the mid-1700s. Now it's been planted as a widespread horticultural plant all around the world, including on the College of San Mateo campus. We have a bunch of this planted. Now, the plant can be used as a source of herbal medicine to improve memory. Of course, don't use herbal products unless you're under the direction of your doctor or herbalist, but it is used for some medicinal purposes. Ginkgo is both deciduous and dioecious, so it has male and female plants. And we only plant the males because the male cones don't have a bad aroma like the female cones do. So the female cones, when they're mature, smell like a dead body, which is thought to help with dispersal because some animals are drawn to that smell. But female plants are rarely planted. There is one planted at the UC Berkeley campus if you ever want to check it out. Next up is phylum Cycadophyta. There are hundreds of species and around 11 genera. They are palm-like in appearance, but they're not palms because remember, palms are monocots that belong to the flowering plants. And the leaves of cycads almost look like ferns, but of course they're not ferns because these are gymnosperms, not seedless vascular plants. Now, like the ferns, the leaves emerge with what's called circinate vernation, and that's how those fiddleheads uncurl as the leaves emerge. The cycads produce cones, both male and female, and they are common in tropical areas and dried forests around the world. We don't have any cycads native to California, but they do grow quite well here as a landscape plant as long as it's warm enough throughout the year. Cycads are all evergreen and dioecious, so we have male or female plants. The cycads are quite ancient. They originated in the Carboniferous time period, which was about 320 million years ago. They're often toxic, so cycads have neurotoxins in their leaves and cones, which is thought to be for anti-herbivory. So if you ever handle a cycad, wash your hands right away. Don't lick a cycad, please. Pollination is generally brought upon by beetles instead of wind. The beetles munch on the pollen, but they get some of it on their body, and then they hopefully land on a female plant nearby. And here's a fun fact. Cycads have the world's largest plant sperm. The sperm cell is so big, it has 10,000 spirally arranged flagella on it. And it's so gigantic that it can barely squeeze itself through the archegonial opening. In fact, the sperm cell is so big that it's visible with the naked eye. So that's kind of a nasty, fun fact. Here we can see pictures of both the pollen and seed cones on a cycad. And our final phylum is the Gnetophyta. And the gnetophytes include just 3 genera that are left on our planet today. The first is the genus Gnetum. There's about 35 species worldwide. They're usually only found in tropical regions, places like Southeast Asia and Africa. These members of the genus Gnetum tend to be woody climbers and vine-like, but there is one tree species. One of these members of Gnetum are used as a food source. In Southeast Asia, they deep fry the strobilus to make a yummy snack. And the members of Gnetum can be either monoecious or dioecious. One of the most unique features of the Gnetum is that they developed vessels in their xylem. And if you look at these pictures, it almost looks like a flowering plant tree. We can see these leaves. They don't look anything like gymnosperm leaves. It looks very similar to an angiosperm, but there's no flowers and fruits produced here. They are reproducing with strobili that are cones. Next up is the genus Ephedra. There's 40 species worldwide, and we have this very commonly found in the deserts of California. It's a shrub with long branches and scale-like reduced leaves. It is dioecious, where we have some plants that are male cones and some plants with female cones. And it can be used in herbal remedies and as a dietary supplement, but it's very dangerous to consume, so be very careful. For example, you might have heard of the drug called Sudafed that has the compound pseudoephedrine in it, which comes from this plant. And the last genus is Welwitschia, and it's monotypic because there's just one species in the world. It has a large taproot that grows below ground, and out of that taproot is a small stem, and then two huge leaves emerge that grow continuously for the life of the plant, which can be over 100 years. It grows in the driest desert in the world. Some years there'll be no rain at all, and yet this plant can survive. It's also interesting that it's dioecious. So even though it's not very common and it grows in such a dramatic environment, one plant will be male and another plant will be female, and they will be miles apart. And yet somehow reproduction will occur. Pretty amazing. Welwitschia is often seen in botanical gardens or in conservatories. So I encourage you to try to check those out sometime. All right, so now we've learned all things gymnosperms. We've done an introduction to what defines a gymnosperm, and we've learned the following phyla: the Coniferophyta, the Ginkgophyta, the Cycadophyta, and the Cnidophyta. As always, please message me with any questions, and thank you very much for listening.